Newman's idea of a university. First of all, I'm not going to shock any of you by asking how many have read it. I'm sure there are not. No, get off it, Richard. I don't believe you. I'm sure a good number of you have read little pieces of it, but I continually be astonished by the number who have not read it. What I'd like to do tonight is look at Newman's idea of a university, but we have to look at it with fresh eyes, because John Henry Newman is one of those figures in Catholic studies who is, I won't say completely misunderstood, but almost completely misunderstood by the vast majority of people. I think the main point I'm going to make tonight will strike you, one of the reasons for that. Now, we're going to look tonight at his idea of a university. It's a book that never had that title until 12 years after he wrote it. And he wrote the initial book about 165 years ago. Now, everyone takes Newman's idea of a university, says that this is the great defense of the arts wing of the university against the science, or I'll use the word science for the moment, against the practical use of versions of the university, and it holds it up as that. But this is a problem, because first of all, Newman wrote it 165 years ago. And the universities have changed dramatically since that time. Even Newman knew they were changing. Secondly, Newman wrote the idea of a university, or wrote the first little group of essays on the university. He started the university, and he was only running it for 5 years. And then he wasn't present there very much even during those 5 years. Newman was an Englishman, and he was asked to start a university in Ireland. And to be quite honest, the Irish didn't care for it. That's all there's to it. And Newman was there only on and off in those 5 years. In fact, the university he began no longer exists. It was started just a year before St. Dunstan's College was started. And it ended as his university, as it were, about 10 years later. Now it was molded into another one and so forth, we won't talk about that. But it's not a long-lasting thing, really. Somehow or other, Newman's initial lectures got put together in this book, which he published 10 years after he started the university, and 5 years after he was out of it, as the title, The Idea of a University. Now, some of you may not know a good deal about Newman. He's an easy man to remember because he was born in 1801 and he died in 1890. So he's roughly the 19th century. And in the middle of that century, almost, 1845, he was born an Anglican. 1845, he became a Roman Catholic. So he's roughly half and half. And he never really made up his mind that he wasn't an Anglican. And he never really, even when he was an Anglican, made up his mind that he was a Roman Catholic. In fact, in the 1870s, he reprinted all his Anglican books. Surprisingly enough, there are very few little statements in them that say, here I don't agree with, or here I changed my mind. There's very little in that he does. Now, Newman was picked up by the universities somewhere around the early 1900s. And almost every university has a Newman Center. Now what happened to Newman Centers was that in the United States in particular, they grew like crazy. And up until about 1970, they were extensively centers that told you what the center thought, not what Newman thought, and attached Newman's name to it. Now, that's one of the difficulties we have, not only in North America, but in the world at large, regarding John Henry Newman. In 1940-ish, mainly after the Second World War, the Germans got interested in Newman and started publishing a little series called Newman Studie. And one of the men that was particularly interested in Newman was Joseph Ratzinger. He was strongly influenced by him. And Ratzinger is probably, and I'll use the name for him when he did the work, probably one of the figures that is responsible for pushing Newman ahead in to the Blessed John Henry Newman work. Now, there were Englishmen that were interested in this too, and there were Frenchmen interested in this, but the French and the German interest in Newman started pretty much after the Second World War. Pretty much. Now, this brings us to the problem of who is Newman. And that is a difficult question for any of us to deal with now. He is a very complex figure. And his idea of a university, probably the best known of his works today in the society at large, makes it even more difficult. The idea of a university that probably most of you have heard of is the idea of a secular university. It's most of his notions that come into the North American universities and even into the British and not so much German, but the British universities are taken from the middle of a book that he wrote called Discourses on the University. Now, he wrote a number of books in the 1850s. In 1851, Newman was in a terrible, terrible problem. He tried to make himself friends of Roman Catholics who didn't care too much for him. He was a Catholic at this time. And he wrote a series of lectures called The Present Position of Catholics in England. But in this book, in the series of lectures which he gave in 1851, and in this book, he made the mistake of attacking a particular Catholic priest. And that priest decided to sue him. Now, this priest was no longer a priest. In fact, he'd been excommunicated from the church long before this. He had joined a rabid Protestant group, and he was making a name for himself all over England by preaching fiercely against Roman Catholics. Newman took him up, challenged him on the issue in one chapter in his book, and this man decided to sue him. Unfortunately, at this point in England, the English state at large was very anti-Catholic. And they put a man in charge of the trial. Newman was found guilty. He was charged a measly £100, but the amount of money that it took to defend him was £12,000, and he was in deep, deep trouble. Just at this time, when this was coming out, he'd been asked by the primate in Ireland to start a university for the Irish. And he came to Dublin and decided to do it. Now remember, this is a man who is starting a university while all this is going on in England. And he's running back and forth. Running back and forth is hardly the word for it. In those days, you didn't have that much. Well, it took a while. You had to get a boat, and you had to go across, and you come back, and so forth. He was tried at this point. He was found guilty of his crime, libel, while he started the university. He started in Dublin in 1852, but the university itself did not open its doors for 2 years after that. In 1852, he wrote a series of lectures on what is a university, and he read 5 of them. Then he had to stop because he had to go back and defend himself in the trial. Then he came back again and he wrote up the rest of them. He kept switching these around until finally in 1872, as I said before, he brought them all out under his title, The Idea of a University. Now, this is a man who is under tremendous pressure at the time. Pressure that comes to him from all kinds of directions. And he writes this book called The Idea of a University, which would eventually be the thing that everyone today reads as a secular university. The difficulty is that it wasn't. The point is that in Newman's writing on The Idea of a University, if you look at it today, even the reprinted version, or the version that eventually he settled on, it's a book that is primarily about the role of theology in a university. There is only 2 chapters in the middle of it which talks about learning aside from theology. And even those things talk about theological education. Now, if I might for a moment switch just a bit to much later in his life. Much later in Newman's life, in 1879, he's made a cardinal. Now, when he's made a cardinal, he has the opportunity to say a few words. Unfortunately, there are very few words, and it's famous Bigleto speech. He makes this speech the night before he receives the cardinal. And in this speech, he says something very interesting. Now, this is the second point I want to make about his idea of a university. His idea of a university today is continually mentioned because of his support of liberalism. But Newman hated liberalism. Now, what we've got to do immediately is put out of our minds all Canadian politics at the time. That just doesn't fit the word liberal. The word liberal has changed dramatically since that day. In Newman's Bigleto speech, he says the following: I rejoice to say, to one great mischief I have from the first opposed myself. For 30, 40, 50 years I have resisted to the best of my powers the spirit of liberalism in religion. Liberalism in religion is the doctrine that there is no positive truth in religion, but that one creed is as good as another, and this is the teaching which is guiding substance and force daily. It is inconsistent with any recognition of any religion as true. It teaches that all are to be tolerated, for all are matters of opinion. Now, this is what Newman said in 1879. This is what he has attacked for 30, 40, 50 years, he says. This is his version of liberalism. Now, when we go to the idea of a university, we get the word liberal used again and again. But the thing about Newman is that it is always used in the context of liberal education, liberal knowledge. There are only 2 places in the whole of his idea of a university, I think, where he uses the word liberal without those words, without education or knowledge attached to it. And that is used only in a very general sense of the word liberal. So, he is concerned then with liberal education and liberal knowledge. And he's concerned with liberal education and liberal knowledge throughout his whole work, which is primarily oriented towards religious education. Now, how do we put these things together? What do we do with it? Well, before I can tell you about that, I have to tell you something about his title, The Idea of a University. Newman wrote, the difficulty with Newman is that we tend to think of him as having written a book, as having reached a conclusion, and then putting forth this conclusion, and that's the way it is. But in fact, Newman's most important books have in their titles either essay or idea. He wrote, for example, in 1845, the book which brought him into the Catholic Church, a book called An Essay in Christian Doctrine. He wrote another book in 1871 called An Essay in Aid of a Grammar of Assent. And then he wrote this book in between these two called The Idea of a University. Now what most people don't realize is that he uses those words distinctly, and that by an essay he means an attempt. An attempt at coming to a conclusion as to what this is that he's talking about. He wrote his essay on Christian doctrine because he saw many doctrines over the years that contradicted themselves, and yet they were held by one church. How do you explain it? So he wrote an attempt to explain this. And when he wrote the idea, he had the same thing in mind. In fact, in 1845, he wrote about the concept of idea and essay together. And if you'll forgive me for just a moment, I'd like to read a little bit of what he means by this. If a great idea is duly to be understood, and much more, if it is to be fully exhibited, it is elicited and expanded by trial and battles into perfection and supremacy. And he ends this chapter by saying his famous words. It changes with them in order to remain the same. It is in a higher world, it is otherwise. But here below, to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. That's what an idea is. He's setting forth an idea, but he admits that any idea you come out with will change over time. It escapes the collision of opinion, even in its earlier years, nor does it remain true to itself, and with a better claim to be considered one and the same, though externally protected from vicissitude and change. It remains, perhaps for a time, quiescent. It tries, as it were, its limbs, and proves the ground under which it feels its way. From time to time, it makes essays, or attempts, which fail, and are in consequence abandoned. And then his famous sentence, it changes with them in order to remain the same. In a higher world it is otherwise, but here below to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. Now that's his notion of the idea of a university. That's his notion of an idea. And to suggest that Newman wrote his book, The Idea of a University, and in this book it gives you the way a university is, and that's the way it is, and you've got to stick to it. That's not what he meant. What he meant was, this is where I'm at today. This is what I'm looking at. This is how theology fits within a university, and I expect people to continue to read my book, but also to continue to think more about it. How will it change? How will it move? It shifts with the shifting times. Now this is why we must be very, very careful about this. And Newman is particularly interested in his book about the role of theology in the university. Theology is a branch of knowledge, he says in the first chapter. In the second, he talks about the bearing of theology on branches of knowledge. He talks about the bearing of other branches of knowledge on theology. He talks about, and he ends his book with knowledge is related to religion. Knowledge is viewed in its relation to religion. The duties of the church toward knowledge. It is only in the two middle sections that he talks about knowledge as its own end. And this is where we come to the central problem of his book, and the central problem that remains to us in the universities today. That is, how can knowledge be its own end? And yet, how can there be an end higher? Well, Newman is interested in that. In 1857, when he was drawing together all these sporadic lectures that he eventually became the idea of the university, when he was drawing them all together, he decided that he was going to write the magnum opus. He never wrote it. He sketched it out in 3 pages. And his first point in what is going to be his magnum opus, his defense of Christianity against the rising power of what he called liberalism. He says, consider first the following, for it comes first, that all our considerations are commenced in a state of profound and dense ignorance poured all around us. Now think of that. That's the way he was going to begin his great magnum opus. He never wrote it. But he says, consider first, and it comes first, that all our considerations are commenced in a state of profound and dense ignorance poured out all around us. These lines are important for him, and they're important for remembering whenever you look at the idea of the university. Humanity, all of us, are centered in ignorance. And we have universities because we are trying in some way to escape ignorance. Now, he goes on to look at this question in a number of ways. And he says that what is a university for? Well, the university, he says, is the power of viewing things at once as one whole. This is what a university is about. The reason you come to a university and take your disparate studies is ultimately so that you can gain the power of viewing many things at once as one whole. A university is about attempting to gain universal knowledge. Thus, it is that form of universal knowledge, he says, set up in the individual intellect and constitutes its perfection. Possessed of this real illumination, the mind never views any part of the extended subject matter of knowledge without recollecting that it is but a part. Somehow or other, we strive for universal knowledge, but we must realize at the same time that it's always, it recollects that it is always but a part. And then he goes on. What do we do in a university? Well, we attempt to perfect our intellects. And this is the result of education. The perfection of the intellect. It's to be imparted to individuals in their respective measures. It is the clear, calm, accurate, and vision and comprehension of all things. But, he goes on, as far as the finite man can embrace them, each in its place, with his own characteristics upon them, it is almost prophetic from its knowledge. Almost, he says. What we should be aiming for in the university is knowledge in its fullest form. And when we reach it, we must realize that it is almost prophetic in its knowledge of history. It is almost heart-searching from its knowledge of human nature. It has almost supernatural charity from its freedom from littleness and prejudice. It has almost the repose of faith, because nothing can startle it. It has almost the beauty and harmony of heavenly contemplation. So intimate is it with the eternal order of things and the music of the spheres. Now this is Newman. He is trying to uphold both these things. And he says it's our tasks in universities to do this. One, to seek universal knowledge, but always realizing that it is almost the beauty and harmony of heavenly contemplation. So intimate is it with the eternal order of things and the music of the spheres. But it's almost. It's always almost. It never reaches that point. Now, the difficulty today is that universities have changed. We live in a university world now, in fact we live in a world generally, in which we have to realize that Christianity is not the #1 version out there. Newman also knew this. And that's why, in his big letter speech, the speech he gave when he received the cardinal's hat, that he said something else. He realized that all of us in the university are aiming to know where things are at, each in our own little way. That we can never achieve it, but we have to aim for it. Hitherto, he says, and this he says in the big letter speech, the civil power has been Christian. Even in countries separated from the church, as in my own. He's talking about England here. He's talking about England. The dictum was in force while I was young, that Christianity was the law of the land. Now, everywhere, that goodly framework of society, which is the creation of Christianity, is throwing off Christianity. Remember, this is well over 125 years ago that he's saying this. Was he a man before his time? Yes, he was. Hitherto it has been considered that religion alone was strong enough to secure submission of the masses of our population to law and order. Now, the philosophers and politicians are bent on satisfying this problem without aid of Christianity. Indeed, instead of the church's authority and teaching, they would substitute, first of all, a universal and a thoroughly secular education, calculated to bring home to every individual that, to be orderly, industrious, and sober, it is his personal interest. As to religion, it is a private luxury, which man may have if he wishes. The liberal principle, this is what he meant by the liberal principle, is forced on us from the necessity of the case. There is much in liberalistic theory which is good and true, he says. He's not rejecting it. There is much in it which is good and true. It is not till we find that this array of principles is intended to supersede, to block out religion, that we pronounce it to be evil. Providence rescues and saves his elect inheritance. Commonly, the church has nothing more to do than to go in her own proper duties, in confidence and peace, to stand still and see the salvation of God. And then he quotes a verse from the Psalms. It's a verse you won't find in the Psalms today because, Newman didn't realize it, but he got it wrong. I say that as a Catholic. It's not in the new official version of the Catholic Church of 1979. It says, "The meek shall inherit the land, and shall delight in abundance of peace." Now this is what Newman is after. Newman thinks that in a university, But in a university, what we must learn to do is to drive firmly and solely toward gaining universal knowledge. No one will ever arrive there. Realizing that the meek shall inherit the earth and shall delight in an abundance of peace. Thank you.
I'd just like to say on behalf of myself, my fellow students in the Catholic New York program, on behalf of Dr. Robert Dennis, and I believe it's safe to say, on behalf of the entire audience here, thank you, Dr. Peter, for gracing us with not just your presence, but the inspiring words that you have just given us. And as a token of our thanks, I would like to present to you this, this gift, which is a portrait of Blessed Cardinal Newman, made by a local artist, Shalise Richard, which I've seen it myself. It's very nice. I hope you like it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.